be here, and I do present to you a perspective that is not typically discussed at summits and conferences like this, and I'm very excited about it. So I will speak for about 25 minutes. We'll have some time for questions, and I do hope that this does generate some interest and some ideas moving forward. So the agenda here is to think about what does the future hold for people, and what is that experience going to be like? What can we expect from what we know about psychology and work? What can we expect from, as we've been hearing in presentations thus far, a kind of compressed workforce? We do know that the distribution of work will be very different in the future. It already is right now than it was 10, 20 years ago. I have done a lot of research on this, both reading and my own research, and I'd like to present some of that to you today. So these are the two major questions to consider. What do we know about what's the psychological impact of work and non-work, and how can this knowledge inform our policies moving forward? So my perspectives: I'm a counseling psychologist, trained specifically in the area of vocational psychology, which is studying the individual experience at work. Over the past 35 years or so, I've been doing this work, and I work as a researcher at Boston College. I'm an academic. I teach. I also do practice. I've been working with clients in this area for 3 decades plus in a small practice on Fridays where I do both therapy as well as career counseling. And I've been conducting a tremendous amount of research. I think it's been a lot. And particularly the last 5 or 10 years, I'm not sure it's all good though, in the last 5 or 10 years, looking at the impact of work in an age of uncertainty, and that's what I'll be speaking about. I've also developed a psychology of working framework and theory, which is a counterpoint to what many of you may know as career development, the career counseling model. I have been somebody who has pushed back at that because I have felt that it's been a very unequal, biased kind of perspective focused only on people with some degree of choice and privilege. My big thing has been to develop a perspective and theories that relate to everybody who works and who wants to work. So let's look at the future via images. Here, I didn't steal a slide from someone else, but someone else, we both used a similar slide. So this one I love. This, of course, many of you have seen the cover of the New Yorker 2 months ago. An amazing cover, actually. I couldn't have thought of it. I couldn't have dreamed of a more relevant cover or painting for this particular presentation. Here's a photo of a factory. And a lot of my students, when I teach courses in counseling, and I train counselors and psychologists, they say, Dr. Blustein, we haven't really seen robots. What are you talking about with robots? Well, most people don't walk into factories. This is a Tesla factory, actually. And as somebody noted, the only time you could really see it is when you turn the light on. This is a restaurant in China with robotic servers. So what we're facing is what I call an unsteady moorings of work. We're facing a period of growing instability at work, and our colleagues have reviewed the data on this in a very compelling way. There's been a kind of hollowing out of the middle class, as Andrew McAbee noted, and we're also seeing a reduction in the labor market participation rate. These are really important indices of what's happening. And what we do know is that this has not been a particularly equal problem. This has particularly hit those with lower levels of skills and mid-level skills. Those who don't have 21st century skills will increasingly be marginalized, and stable and decent work is increasingly becoming difficult to find for many people. So what is the role of work in people's lives? This taxonomy here comes from some of the writing I've done and also some current research, which I'm going to talk about very briefly. But these are some of the needs that working can fulfill. Of course, working can fulfill the needs for survival, also for social connection, a sense of self-determination, of being able to kind of be the best we can be, being part of something bigger than ourselves. And this one I will say briefly that in relation to retail, my mother worked in retail, not at the level of Mark Cohen. She worked at a store, native New Yorkers will know it, Mays Department Store in Glen Oaks, Queens. And what she said to me once was, she said, and I don't remember what I said to her to evoke this, but I must have said something a little snarky. She goes, your father and I have jobs that are meaningful. And actually, my mom's job was, she didn't like standing on her feet all day, but she sold cosmetics. And what she said was, I'm able to help the people in our community buy cosmetics and help them look good at a low cost. And she was great, and over the years where she lived in retirement in Florida, so many people knew her and said, "Didn't you work in Maze?" It was a very meaningful job for her. Well, not an easy job, very low paying job. But she had a sense of being part of something bigger than ourselves. I also have been writing more recently about the need for caregiving work, and I have a lot of thoughts on that. And also work functions in allowing us to be the best that we can be. And what I'm writing about in a current book, which will be out sometime in 2018, called The Impact of Work in an Age of Uncertainty, what I'm writing about, one of the main themes in this book is that work is one of the ways in which we feel most alive in the world. Not the only way, and of course, it does not work for a lot of people who have onerous jobs, who have jobs where they're harassed, where their dignity is taken away. But when work goes well, we feel very much alive. So one of the best examples of this is to consider what children are like when they're playing in the sand. We've all seen this. And we've all had our own kids or grandkids, and thinking about how hard it is to extricate them from the sand. You always had to have like 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and you started over again. They were engaged in projects. They were engaged in meaningful projects. And in some ways, that's what work can function for us if we have access to decent work. And when I use the term decent work, I'm using the International Labor Organization's definition of decent work. So the question, does everyone feel alive at work? The answer here, of course, is a definitive no. There's been a rise in precarious work, tremendous rise in precarious work. Precarious work being the work that is unstable, short-term contract work. I've seen this both in my clients and students, people getting hired short-term. And it's kind of like everybody's working to get tenure, even at lower level jobs. Sometimes my wife says, "Why are you working so hard?" I said, "I'm still trying to get tenure. I've gotten tenure so far at 2 universities, but it's embedded in my mind." But for those who are working on the front edges of this kind of really jagged workforce, people who are on these short-term contracts with the possibility of being hired on are struggling, working sometimes 10, 12 hours a day just to prove themselves. There's also an emerging erosion in the workplace. This has been one of the main themes of the research I'm going to present here. So here's a definition of precarious work. It is, in many ways, precarious work is really uncertain, unstable, and insecure. And as 2 of my colleagues in sociology have written, what we've done with precarious work is we've shifted the risk of work from employers to employees. I'm not a big fan of that. And some of the consequences are, and the research is very clear on this, increases in physical problems, increases in mental health problems, and a growing disengagement with the social world. Andrew McAfee's data was very compelling on the rise of death by substance abuse. That's an exemplar of this kind of alienation that people are experiencing. So what does this erosion look, how does it look? And here's how it looked in the study that forms the basis of my new book. The study was based on 61 interviews we conducted with people across the United States, very in-depth interviews. We did qualitative research with them, and we had a sample that ranged everywhere from homeless people living in shelters to CEOs. We have a congressperson, we have a general who was deployed overseas, but it's mostly people in the middle and the lower ends of the workforce. These are some of the things that emerged in our research. Growing competition between communities and individuals. This was one of the most devastating things I've read about, where people were critiquing other groups who were also struggling to gain a foothold. We saw the rise of the Trump voter. Our data was collected in 2013 to 2015. You could predict it in looking at our qualitative research. Increases in bullying and harassment, diminishing social support, unsafe physical conditions, and what I call this project, the Boston College Working Project, we saw the rise of what I call a hard edge in the workplace. A very hard edge, very different from the one that my mother described at May's department store, where everybody knew her and loved her. And she, even though she worked so hard, she felt love there. It was a very different experience. So what do we do when work disappears? And here I will give gratitude for taking this title from William Julius Wilson, who wrote an amazing book 21 years ago called When Work Disappears, speaking of prescient books, this book in many ways describes what happened in urban Chicago post-World War II, which was gutted by lack of employment. And he describes it brilliantly using social science research data, quantitative and qualitative research, and he outlined what the implications are. Now, in terms of the research on unemployment and mental health, we have a very rich literature on this in psychology. The research literature is very clear. Mental health problems are twice as likely among the long-term unemployed. The causal factor is unemployment. There used to be this view in psychology that some of the causes of unemployment might be what we call the downward drift hypothesis. Thankfully, that hypothesis has been disabused. Most of the mental health problems that happen to those who are long-term unemployed are resolved by having the person get a new job. Mental health problems are more common among men, blue-collar workers, and people who've been unemployed for a long period of time. What I'm going to introduce now are some of the excerpts from my study on the right-hand side of each slide. And I'm just giving you some of these qualitative passages. I'm not going to read them to you, but I'd like you to read them as I speak. This one here is from an amazing participant who described how he became unemployed. And it was an interview that I conducted myself that really was bone-chilling. So Americans, we know this from research by a good friend of mine, Ofer Sharon, a great sociologist who wrote a book on comparing the long-term unemployed in Israel and the US. What we know is that Americans are more likely than other people, long-term unemployed in other countries, to blame themselves. My analysis of this, and I think Ofer's analysis concurs, is it's part of the individualistic ethos. Americans in some ways take more credit for when things go well. People take all kinds of credit when they've had all kinds of social capital. I remember what Ann Richards said to George H.W. Bush, that you think, you hit a triple, you're on third base and you think you hit the triple. He was born on third base. So that's a part of an analogy that's a very poignant one right now. Many of us remember that. Very good comment. And unemployment has devastating consequences for individuals and for their families. This is a discussion of the social implications, which I think are most evident in Wilson's research. Even though it's 21 years old, it is still relevant. I'm not a person who says we should only use the most recent research. This study was had incredible foresight. And what Wilson found here is the loss of work in communities led to devastation, loss of identity for men and women. He argues that that's part of what caused the rise of the single-parent family, was that when men lost their jobs, they lost their identity, they lost their capacity to feel strong and vital about themselves, and they were less likely to invest in family life. Loss of connection to the community, disengagement in life, and psychological pain and anguish. So what does a future look like without stable work? We could look at examples both from outside the US and within the US. And actually there's been some great reports by multinational groups like OECD and World Economic Forum. Especially the OECD has written a really good report with 5 scenarios about what work would look like if it really is reduced rapidly. And 3 out of 5 of them are so dystopian that they remind me of the movie The Road, which I still get bad dreams about. But 2 out of 5 are not bad. But one of the things that we could see is a rise in civil unrest, an increase in substance abuse, which we're seeing already, growing individualism, and a loss of the sense of we, which a number of people are still studying the classic book, The Corrosion of Character by Richard Sennett, describing that loss of sense of we, and a shift toward populist and simplistic solutions about the loss of decent work. We're seeing this right now. You could look at the work of Robert Putnam's most recent work, has talked about the loss of connection as a result of the deterioration of work. So looking at this issue of the impact of work in an age of uncertainty, some of the challenges are, actually in this one, I do want to touch on this quote. This was an amazing quote. I did this interview as well with a homeless woman at a one-stop career center in downtown Boston, African-American woman, who literally said, "I'm in desperate stuff, I'm willing to be a slave, to do whatever I have to do." She was living in a shelter and she was forced out in these shelters. The idea was you had to go out of the shelter and look for a job from 9 to 5, which meant they had to go find a library with a computer. Because the idea of going and applying at stores, we just discussed, these stores don't exist, and you have to do the online applications. The shelters were thinking of the labor market 30 years ago. So this was a very profound experience for me to interview her. So people are suffering. Even those working full-time jobs were frightened. People are anxious and fearful about the future, and those who are out of work are particularly hard hit. So what emerged in our study was the sense of two different Americas. There's an America of people working for survival, and there's another America where people are working for self-determination. This brings to mind a great book from 1962 by Michael Harrington, The Other America, a wonderful book, professor from Queens College. I was talking to folks last night about the CUNY system. Great system, underrated system. Michael Harrington wrote a book that really, in some ways, informed the war on poverty. But these findings underscore Harrington's findings that we're seeing basically two types of work experiences. The research we're doing indicates that people are moving back and forth between survival and self-determination. It's not really a linear process, and my sense is that the future of work will cause greater and greater cycles of work for self-determination, work for survival. And I think without a good safety net, it's going to be a very, very hard process for people. So I did indicate in my title that there were challenges and there were also opportunities, and I do want to speak about those opportunities. I do think we could have a social contract that can be restored. The United States had a really good social contract after World War II in terms of work and what people could expect from work. I've written a paper recently on how much of the thinking about work, labor economics, career development, my field of biopsychology, these fields in some ways I think were seduced by the myth of the post-war economic boom, which was unheralded and basically stopped in the early 70s as we hit unemployment rates of 11 and 12% again. So I think we have really eroded the social contract between people. But there are some pluses about technology and jobs, as someone pointed out earlier. A lot of the jobs that are tedious, that are really hard to do, can be replaced by automation and are being replaced by automation. Work could theoretically be more meaningful for people. How could psychology contribute to these humane solutions? One is what I'd like to help infuse into our debate is that work fulfills important human and psychological functions. If we don't consider these psychological functions about work, even though you've got the best macro level economic data, you've got brilliant people thinking about labor market, if you don't think about that, we're in for a lot of problems. We need to think about issues around what it means for people to be able to survive and to be able to thrive. So the research that we've done, myself and others, indicates that work provides an opportunity for people to engage in meaningful activities. It connects people to the broader social and economic world, and it gives people an opportunity to create and to contribute. Some of the implications for public policy. Here I might be, hopefully won't be stepping on too many toes, but I do have some views that have evolved in me over the last 20 plus years of doing this research. First thing is on human rights and working. The United Nations passed Declaration of Human Rights in the late 1940s. International Labor Organization, which I've been doing some work for lately, has also put together policy statements from 1919. The ILO actually preceded the UN. They're coming up on their 100th anniversary. Everybody believes in human rights and working, but actually not everybody believes it. I mean, we have people on the far right of our political spectrum who don't believe that people have an entitlement to work. And I would be in favor of reintroducing the human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, at least for debate. Because people often say, yeah, fine, I believe in that, but to believe in it and to make it happen will require radical restructuring in this country. Another thing that's coming up is unpacking work from sustainability. And here we could talk about issues around the basic income guarantees, which I know are discussed in Silicon Valley. They're discussed a lot in Europe. They're actually discussed from the right and from the left. The conversations from the right, at least in Europe, on the basic income guarantees are kind of frightening because what they want to do is give people a block sum of money, then take away all other social welfare supports. Actually, it's a very rich debate right now in Germany about this. Pull away free tuition at schools, pull out health care, let people pay for it themselves. Kind of like block grants to the states. So you have to be careful when you look at these basic income guarantee discussions because they're really quite complex. Then the issue of what is education going to look like in this age of uncertainty. We spoke about this last night at dinner. I've been involved in this issue for quite some time, and I'm working with a colleague at Boston College now, an education scholar. We're trying to develop some ideas on this. What is the narrative that we tell kids from K through 16 about why to do well in school? You know, certainly there are other narratives, build up your citizenship, but part of it is you want to have a good career. You want to have choice in what you do. What happens if that's no longer an option? How do we change the narrative in schools? I know we have some people speaking about that shortly. We need to develop more humane policies about work. One of the things I would love to see happen in the Democratic Party is for somebody to develop a policy about work, a human rights infused policy about work. We need also to underscore how certain attributes cannot be easily replaced by automation, empathy and creativity being the two most obvious ones. And then I think we also need to seriously think about infusing the ILO's decent work agenda, which was put out 1999, very specific agenda that's being used throughout the world to drive labor policy, to think about that in relation to the future of work. So at this point, for further information, I have 2 books out, and I will have another one coming out in 2018, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you. Roy Bahat from Bloomberg Beta. You touched on this when you started talking about basic income guarantees. I don't know the ILO definition, but I assume it means paid work. And I'm curious how you think about the dignity and psychological aspects associated with unpaid or dramatically underpaid work. Society needs it, and we just happen not to count it in GDP.
Well, that's a great question, and I will talk briefly about this. I do think that we can create more work much more easily than people think. It will require a massive reconceptualization of how we spend our public funds. So, yes, the basic income guarantees are seen as something that can help people who are not able to work in the marketplace. And that number is probably going to grow. But I do think there's enough tasks that can be done in our society. Some of people spoke about it earlier, infrastructure. But one of the things that I think is a huge open area is increased support for caregiving work, teaching, mentoring, counseling, nursing. There's a tremendous need. Why do we have to have 30 students in a class? If we had 10 students in a class, you'd need 3 times as many teachers. Now, people might say, well, the people who are losing jobs may not have the skill set to go into teaching. I heard people discuss this earlier. Well, one of the issues is that we may not be doing a good job of educating people. I'm not a big fan of the Murray Herrnstein book on the bell curve. I think there were a lot of mistakes there. I think there's a lot more mutability in people's intelligence. As a psychologist, I can tell you a lot of us see it as highly mutable, highly changeable, and I think we could do a really good job of helping people to train for jobs that involve caregiving kinds of activities, as well as infrastructure work. So I think we could do a lot better job of creating work. People say, how do you pay for it? It's not going to happen during this presidential administration, that's for sure. But as Obama said, political winds do shift. And once we start seeing unemployment in larger numbers, people might rethink things. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I'm really glad you raised that question because I'm recalling that our friend Andrew McAfee told us that the iron laws of economics promised us that care work could not be adequately compensated. And I think you are giving us a very good counterpoint to that.
Actually,
we're suggesting fundamentally that the organization of work and compensation can be renegotiated.
Actually, can I just...
There are no iron laws
Exactly. In fact,
that determine compensation.
One of Andrew's colleagues at MIT just wrote a brilliant book on care work, Paul Osterman. I don't know if anybody has seen this, but it's a very specific book on how to create higher paying, more legitimate care work, primarily for home health care aides. And what he argues in this book, brilliantly I thought, is that we need to change each occupation in very specific ways. And the Osterman example of personal care work, making it more economically viable, was a brilliant idea. And what it's going to require from economists is a deeper dive into each occupation. So that's, I thought, a great example of how you can make changes in care work. And they didn't involve radical political solutions. They involved some fine-tuning of some policies.
In fairness to Andrew, he advocated the earned income tax credit, which is a way to take jobs where the market pays a low income and decide as a society that we're going to raise that income level.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, I'm Ioana Marinescu, labor economist at the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm going to almost go against my own camp in asking why do we necessarily need everyone to do paid market work, and understanding the cultural underpinnings of that, because you mentioned that Americans, for example, will blame themselves for being unemployed. And I've been studying basic income, and one of the interesting things is that one of the reasons why this might be a hard idea to pass in the US is that the Americans, much more than Europeans, where I'm from, are likely to say that the poor are poor because of their own responsibility. It's their fault that they're poor, therefore we don't need to do something for them. And so, that's a cultural belief. And so I wonder, can you say more about cultural variability in the centrality of paid work in people's lives? Thanks.
Great question. My thought on that is that I don't think people absolutely need to be doing paid work to have a meaningful and purposeful life. I don't think that the research in psychology does support the fact that when people are engaged in meaningful activities, they're more likely to have higher levels of well-being. That those meaningful activities don't have to be marketplace work. What I think we will have to do is find ways to access meaningful activities for people, so that one of my comments in my new book is going to be unpacking sustainability from meaningful work. We can have meaningful work that's not necessarily sustaining us. So I do believe that. The American people will probably, the United States will probably be one of the last countries to adopt basic income guarantees because of this individualistic ethos, which can be changed, by the way.
Right. So about basic income, some utopians believe that everybody can have basic income and that's it. But keep in mind that if everybody gets all the money from the government, then the government has to get back all the money in order to pay again. So basically, the utopian basic income is almost exactly the same as utopian Marxism. You can only have the government owning everything. It's pure mathematics.
Yeah, actually, I'm not in favor of a guaranteed basic income. I'm in favor of a means-tested income for people who need it. I just met with a really brilliant German economist at an ILO meeting, Gerhard Bosch. Some of you may know of him, who really educated me on this. And his view is that the guaranteed income is problematic, but a means-tested kind of income guarantee makes a lot of sense. If people need it, they can get it. But just giving people money, some of the views in Europe, where you give everybody the same amount no matter how wealthy they are, that doesn't hold water for me.
Last question over there.
Hi, thanks. Marie Desjardins, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I just wanted to pull together a couple of threads, something that you mentioned earlier in your talk about the fact that unemployment, losing one's job, has a more negative impact on men than on women. And then the comment about the difference between how we perceive paid work in the United States versus Europe. Well, we've historically had lots of unpaid work by women
Absolutely.
in this country, and you didn't talk about gender at all. I don't think we've talked about gender at all today, but I think gender is an incredibly important issue in this conversation, and thinking about the increasing care work and the value that we place on care work, which has historically been unpaid women's work and therefore devalued.
I've very involved in those issues. I didn't have the time to get into it, but you could also say, why didn't I make the time? the issues of gender are critically important, and gender has been kind of embedded into discussions of care work. And one of the reasons why I believe care work is so marginalized is because it's mostly done by women. So one of the things that I'm considering is, and this is obviously a little bit out of my area because it involves more of an economics perspective, is linking care work to basic income, so that if people are doing care work, that they should be able to get retirement benefits, and if there are income guarantees for people who are not in the marketplace, people would get a reasonable amount of money and not be stigmatized for it or put through humiliating kinds of make-work projects. So I'm totally in favor of that. Both of my books discuss issues of gender and care work in depth. And in one of the books, I have a whole chapter from a colleague of mine, Mary Sue Richardson, who's written brilliantly on this issue. So thank you for you bringing up the issue. It's very important. And it was lack of time why I didn't really get into it.
Thank you again.
Thank you.